Hey everyone! Today we're diving into an interesting story about two princes who both wanted to be the King of France. It all started when King Charles IV of France died without any children to take his place. This left two people fighting over the throne. One was Philip, the Count of Valois, who was a cousin to the last few kings of France. The other was Edward III, the King of England, whose mother Isabella was the sister of Charles IV. When it came time to pick a new king, the French nobles and townspeople chose Philip. He was French, while Edward was English. On top of that, Philip was a powerful nobleman, and many people thought they'd gain his favor by making him king. But they were wrong. Once Philip became King Philip VI, he turned on the nobles who had supported him. He was worried they might become too powerful and challenge him. Even though he was the king, Philip didn't have much more land or power than some of his richest subjects. Oddly enough, Philip was called the Fortunate, even though his time as king was filled with problems. Philip loved fancy things, so his coronation was a huge event with feasts, dancing, and tournaments. But the celebration didn't last long. Soon his cousin, Count Louis of Flanders, came to him for help. The people of Flanders were rebelling against Louis, and he needed Philip's support. Philip, excited by the idea of leading an army and winning battles, quickly agreed to help. It didn't take long for Philip to gather an army. The French nobles were eager to join because they saw it as a chance to fight and loot the wealthy towns of Flanders. Philip's army, described as one of the best in the world, marched into Flanders and set up camp at the bottom of a hill called Castle. At the top of the hill, the Flemish soldiers were ready to fight. But their leader wanted to check out the French camp first. Disguised as a fish merchant, he went into the camp and saw French knights relaxing, playing chess, and strolling around in fancy clothes. Meanwhile, Philip was eating dinner as if he were back home in Paris. The Flemish leader realized this was the perfect time to attack. He rushed back to his men and told them to strike while the French were unprepared. The Flemish army quietly moved down the hill in three groups and attacked the French camp. Things were chaotic, and Philip himself was almost captured. But the French quickly regrouped. Their larger numbers and better training helped them defeat the Flemish soldiers. The Flemish leader was killed, and his army was crushed. With this victory, the rebellion in Flanders ended. The people of Flanders gave up, and Count Louis was back in charge. Philip returned to Paris, proud of his success. Philip's confidence grew after his victory. Soon he demanded that Edward III of England come and honor him as the ruler of the Duchy of Guyenne, a territory in France that Edward controlled. Edward traveled to the French city of Amiens with his nobles to meet Philip. According to a writer from that time named Froissart, Edward honored Philip with only mouth and word, refusing to perform the usual act of placing his hands in Philip's hands. Edward did this because he wanted to keep his claim to the French throne open. Philip could tell that Edward wanted to be King of France someday, so he did everything he could to make life difficult for him. He disrupted England's trade with Flanders, tried to take Guyenne from Edward, and even supported Robert the Bruce of Scotland, Edward's enemy. For a while, Edward was too busy fighting in Scotland to deal with Philip. But once those battles were over, Edward turned his attention to France. He was determined to make Philip pay for all the trouble he had caused, and to claim the French throne for himself. And this was the beginning of the 100 Years' War, a prolonged and fierce conflict between France and England that stretched across more than a century. It wasn't constant fighting, but a series of bloody battles, tense standoffs, and uneasy periods of truce. The war began in 1337, when Edward III of England formally declared war on King Philip VI of France. At the time, one of Edward's strongest allies was Jacob van Artevelde, a wealthy brewer from Flanders, who played a significant role in rallying the Flemish people to support Edward's claim. The first major clash of this epic war took place in 1340, and it wasn't fought on land but at sea, near the port town of Sluys in Flanders. For years, the French fleet had been wreaking havoc along the English coastline. They attacked merchant ships, disrupted trade routes, and even launched bold raids. One infamous Sunday morning, while the townspeople were at church, French ships brazenly sailed into the English port of Southampton, setting it ablaze and looting what they could. These acts of aggression could not be ignored, and by June of 1340, Edward III was ready to retaliate in full force. The English king left London with a massive fleet, carrying soldiers who were eager to prove their mettle. As they neared Sluys, the sight of the French fleet waiting ahead was both daunting and motivating. The number of French ships was overwhelming. Their masts clustered so closely together they looked like a dense forest rising out of the sea. Among the enemy vessels was a familiar sight, the Christopher, a large English ship that the French had captured during a previous skirmish. The sight of their own ship flying French colors only fueled the determination of Edward's men to reclaim it and assert their dominance. Edward was thrilled at the chance to confront the French fleet head-on. "I've been waiting for this moment," he declared to his men. "With God's favor, we will finally face these enemies." He quickly demonstrated his tactical skill by ordering the fleet to adjust its position. This maneuver placed the sun at the English backs and directly in the eyes of the French, blinding them and making it harder for them to see the approaching attack. The French mistook this repositioning for a retreat and jeered, believing the English were too afraid to fight. "They're running away," some of them laughed. But their confidence would soon turn to panic. As the English fleet closed in, they used hooks and chains to latch onto the French ships. The battle turned into a brutal melee, with soldiers fighting hand-to-hand on the decks. The clash of swords, the swing of battle axes, and the whistling of arrows created a chaotic and deadly scene. The English were relentless, and one of their first objectives was to recapture the Christopher. With sheer determination, they overpowered the French crew, reclaimed their ship, and swiftly manned it with skilled English archers. These archers rained arrows down on the French fleet, turning the Christopher into a devastating weapon against its former captors. The battle raged on for hours, beginning early in the morning and continuing until late afternoon. The French fleet was gradually pushed back toward the harbor at Sluys, where they found themselves cornered. At this critical moment, Flemish forces joined the fight, striking the French from another direction. The combined assault was overwhelming. Thousands of French sailors and soldiers were killed in the chaos. Many, desperate to escape, leapt into the sea, but the waters offered no salvation. Most drowned, weighed down by their armor or pulled under by the currents. By the end of the day, the English had secured a resounding victory. The French fleet was decimated, and Edward III had proven the might of his navy. When news of the disaster reached Paris, the court was paralyzed with fear. No one wanted to be the one to deliver the grim report to King Philip VI. Finally, the court jester, known for his sharp wit and boldness, broke the silence. "The English are cowards," he quipped. Philip, puzzled, asked, "Why would you say such a thing?" The jester replied with a sly grin, "Because they didn't have the courage to jump into the sea at Sluys like the French did." The king instantly understood the devastating truth. His fleet had been utterly destroyed. His fury was unmatched, and even the jester, usually immune to royal wrath, quickly left the room. The defeat at Sluys was a bitter blow for Philip, but it was only the beginning of a long and grueling war. In the aftermath of the battle, a temporary truce was negotiated between France and England. Edward III returned to England, his reputation greatly enhanced by the victory. However, both sides knew that the conflict was far from over. The 100 Years' War would continue to shape the destinies of both nations, bringing moments of triumph and tragedy for generations to come.